Okay, let's talk about the production of extracellular fluid. So, in our previous part of the lecture, we talked about continuous capillaries and how in a continuous capillary with those leaky junctions between the endothelial cells, water and ions can move into the capillary from the extracellular fluid or from the blood out to the extracellular fluid. The question is, which way is water going to move? So really what I'm asking is, if we've got a capillary here, is water going to move this way or that way? We call this movement filtration. That's movement from the blood out to the ECF. We call this absorption. So, will capillaries filter or absorb? This has to do with where extracellular fluid comes from. The fluid out here, outside the blood vessels, around your cells, extracellular fluid, comes from your blood. So we need to understand what's making water move out or in. Take a moment to erase that. And let's talk about what forces are going to be acting on water that might cause it to move one way or the other. So when we talk about the movement of water in and out of these capillary, we're going to be talking about a phenomenon called bulk flow, which just refers to water moving according to passive transport forces. The forces involved are going to be hydrostatic pressure, which is really just blood pressure. This is the pressure that was applied by the heart or the arteries to that blood, and that pressure is now pushing outward on the walls of the blood vessels. That's what pushes the blood downstream, but it also pushes the vessel walls outward, and it acts to push water out of the capillaries. This is for the same reason that if I have, say, a hose on my wall, and it's got a leak in it, if I turn on the water, pressure is applied to the water in the hose by the water in the pipes in my house. That pressure is pushing outward on the walls of the hose, and it will cause a leak from that hose. That water flowing out is coming from hydrostatic pressure, pushing outward on the water. The other force that can act on water in capillaries is osmotic force, sometimes also known as colloid osmotic pressure. This pressure comes from the fact that there's a higher concentration of proteins in the blood plasma than in the extracellular fluid. So if I look at a capillary, I find that I have proteins dissolved in the blood. You know all about those already. That's all of the albumin, all the globulins, the clotting factors, all of that stuff. They're in the blood. And there's very little out here in the extracellular fluid. So the ECF has almost no proteins, whereas the blood has lots of proteins. And you know what happens when there's a difference in concentration of a material. That exerts an osmotic force, which tends to make water go toward the higher osmolarity, the higher concentration of solutes. In this case, that's inside the blood vessel. So we've got these two forces acting on water. Hydrostatic force pushing it out, osmotic force pulling it in. We need to understand how those are going to interact to determine which way water is going to move. So let's erase this, and instead draw up a capillary. Draw it a little bigger than that. We're going to have blood going this direction. So this will be my arteriole. This will be my venule. This is the capillary. So the blood's going that way. Now, we're going to look at both of those forces. Let's start with hydrostatic pressure. We'll do that one in red. No, let's do it up here. So hydrostatic pressure. You've learned something about blood pressure already. You know that the heart and the major arteries are what applies that pressure. You know that that pressure acts to push the blood away from the heart. And then that pressure gets less as we go further away. Remember, we talked about how the pressure drops off with distance from the heart. Here where we get to the capillaries, our pressure has diminished to the point where the outward hydrostatic pressure at the arterial side of the capillary is somewhere around 35 millimeters of mercury. So 35 outward. That's the force pushing water out of this capillary. That force diminishes over the length of the capillary till by this side it's down to about 15 millimeters of mercury. Remember, pressure drops with distance from the heart. So we can draw these arrows getting smaller as we go along. Just pressure dropping off from about 35 to about 15. But it's still outward over the whole length of the capillary. Now we can also add osmotic pressure. Remember, this is coming from the fact that there are proteins here in the blood plasma that we do not find out in the ECF. The concentration of those proteins doesn't change very much over the length of the capillary, which means the osmotic forces aren't going to change very much either. They're about 25 millimeters of mercury going in, pulling water in. And that's going to stay fairly constant. So here on the arterial side of the capillary, we have outward forces of about 35 millimeters of mercury and inward forces of about 25. Here on the venous side, we've got outward forces of about 15 and inward forces of about 25. So let's look at how those are going to interact. Now, my question is, which way is water going to move right here? Really, the answer is, well, which force is greater? If I've got 35 units of pressure pushing out and 25 pulling in, overall outward has more pressure than inward, which means overall my water will be moving outward. Now notice up and down don't matter here. It's outward or inward. So this is outward, inward, outward is greater, so we're going out of the blood vessel. So right here, we favor filtration. More water is moving outward than inward. It's true, water will be moving both ways. Some will be moving in by osmosis, but more will be moving outward according to hydrostatic pressure. So the overall movement is outward. If we look at this spot, it's still more outward than inward, but a little less so. Here, it's just barely more outward than inward. Here, it looks like they're just about balanced. And here, the inward starts to become greater than the outward. Here even more so. And here even a little more. Over on this side, we are favoring absorption. Overall, water is moving into the capillary over on the venous side. So the question, which way is water going, is not totally simple. It depends on where you are along the capillary. At the arterial side, the higher hydrostatic pressure favors filtration. Over on the venous side, we're now switched more toward osmotic pressure is higher, so we're favoring absorption. I might, though, ask the question, overall, which way is water going to go? If I averaged all of this out, if I took the whole capillary, overall, is water going outward or inward? On this diagram, it looks like it's fairly close to balanced, and it is close. But in the end, we have a slight bias, most of the time, toward filtration. That bias is enough that overall, if I took all of my capillaries together and added up all of the filtration, the slight bias toward filtration that goes on over the course of a day, I filter out about 3 liters of water per day out of all of my capillaries. So altogether, my blood loses about 3 liters of water a day, which is interesting because 3 liters is roughly how much water my blood contains, which is kind of an interesting thing. Over the course of a day, most of the water in my blood actually leaves my blood and enters my tissue as extracellular fluid, which is a little hard to believe, because if I were adding 3 liters of fluid to my tissues all the time, my tissue should be swelling up. I should look like the Michelin Man, if anyone knows who that is. I want to get suddenly very swollen. I should be getting a lot of tissue edema, and yet I don't. Why? Well, let's talk about that in just a moment here. Okay, so the question we were asking is, if I overall filter about 3 liters a day, and that becomes extracellular fluid, why don't my tissues swell up and my blood become a thick, sludgy mess? The main reason for that is this. So let's imagine that I've got that capillary we just drew in my tissue, and I am filtering out overall three liters a day into my ECF. This is where extracellular fluid comes from. The fluid around my cells is just filtered blood plasma, just the water from my blood. What's going to happen to that ECF? As it turns out, in my tissues, I have these interesting vessels. This is a lymphatic capillary. I've drawn it with dotted lines because it's a little bit like a sinusoidal capillary. It's got big holes in the wall, really big openings that allow water, any dissolved material, fragments of cells, even whole cells, to go from the tissue and ECF into this lymphatic capillary. So coming in here, I will have water, cellular debris, proteins, etc. Think of this almost as sewage, like a storm drain. From the tissue, anything in the tissue where there's more of it than we need, this extra water that's coming out, we suck some of that up. Dead cells that get taken apart, we suck up the debris. Bacteria, we pull them in. All sorts of stuff from the tissues gets taken up by these lymphatic capillaries. These lymphatic capillaries feed into these lymph nodes. So this sewage from my tissues, dead cells, debris, extracellular fluid, all of that, travels into these lymph nodes, which are full of macrophages and other cells that will engulf, digest, break down all the stuff in there that we don't need anymore, and feed it on into more lymphatic vessels. And we feed through a series of lymph nodes that gradually clean all of this stuff up. Think of them as sewage treatment plants. And in the end, I end up in a couple of major lymph vessels, which are going to return to my blood circulation at some of my major veins. So after this fluid, which we now call lymph, this mixture of extracellular fluid and cellular debris and whatever, gets cleaned up by the lymph nodes, eventually it gets returned to my blood supply, largely up here under my collarbones. So this lymphatic system is for taking up extracellular fluid, cleaning and recycling it, and returning it to the blood in a useful form. It's the sewage treatment system of the body. It also plays a major immune role because a lot of material from my tissue gets processed by the lymph these lymph nodes do a lot to detect and destroy incoming microorganisms. The lymphocytes play a major role in the lymphatic system. That's one of the reasons why when you get ill, oftentimes you get swollen lymph nodes as your battleground tissues are having all of that debris and dead cells processed by these lymph nodes. Sometimes they can get a little clogged. In the worst situation, they can also become places where invading microorganisms live. You can end up with lymph nodes as a source of infection. It's also why it can be an issue in cancer, because if you have a body cell which becomes cancerous and is now replicating out of control, if those cancer cells get into the lymphatic system, which they can because of these big holes in the wall, they can travel through there into the bloodstream and end up anywhere in the body. That's the idea of metastasis. So we want to avoid that if we can. If you have cancer, you want to keep it confined to one area as much as possible so that it can be surgically removed. And that pretty much covers the idea of ECF production. We end up filtering a little more fluid than we absorb. We produce ECF, and then it ends up recycled by the lymphatic system. There are some interesting things with that. For example, you can imagine, since my ECF production and bulk flow comes from the fact that my hydrostatic pressure is balanced out by my osmotic pressure, if you changed one of those, if, for example, I raised my blood pressure, my hydrostatic pressure too much, you might expect me to then be filtering more than my lymphatic system can handle. And if I'm putting more fluid into tissue than my lymphatic system can remove, I get tissue edema, which is one of the symptoms of high blood pressure, amazingly enough. So, that about does it for the cardiovascular system. We added the lymphatic system there on the very end. I hope that all worked out okay, and our next part in the class we're going to get to is the respiratory system, so we'll start those lectures soon here.